on the World Wide Web. The boy on the cover of this book, the little bugler, actually served in the Union Army during the Civil War and was part of the battles of Gettysburg and Chancellorsville. This boy, Gustav Sherman, was 12 years old. William Steiple tells his story in the book, and we spoke with the author at the Cedar Creek Civil War battlefield near Winchester, Virginia. Mr. Steiple also gives us a look at camp life during the war and a battle reenactment.
We're with William Steiple, the author of The Little Bugler. We'll get to this very unique story in just a few minutes. But first, Bill, where are we?
We are at the Cedar Creek battlefield, which is in the Shenandoah Valley, a few miles south of Middletown, Virginia. And this is a living history weekend. We're having an annual reenactment of the Battle of Cedar Creek, and also raising awareness for battlefield preservation. To call attention that some of the sites throughout the United States are in jeopardy of being developed upon.
In the annals of Civil War battles, Cedar Creek is not up there with Shiloh and Chickamauga and such, but it still has its dramatic moments.
It is credited by most historians as the battle that clinched the re-election of President Lincoln. Remember that the Union Army wasn't doing too well in the early parts of 1864 in those campaigns, and Confederate General Early was causing some havoc here in the Shenandoah Valley, and General Grant sent General Sheridan down here to take care of business, and General Early had a surprise morning attack which routed the Union Army here, and at the time General Sheridan was in Winchester, rallied the retreating Union Army and swept on to victory.
We'll talk more about the reenactors and the camp and such here. But first, let's get Gustav Sherman. Tell me, in a nutshell, who he was, what this book is centered around.
Gustav Sherman was a 12-year-old boy. Was born in Germany in 1849, emigrated to the United States in 1850 with his parents. They settled in New York City. And after the firing of Fort Sumter, New York City was a vast army volunteer station, it seemed, and Gustav was caught up in all this bustling patriotism and wanted to enlist in a Union regiment. His father had enlisted in the 40th New York Infantry as a regimental bugler. His father had instructed Gustav on how to play many instruments, and he was considered a prodigy with the drum. But being 12 years old, the colonel of the 40th New York, Colonel Riley, at first rejected Gustav, saying too young and too small, and that brought tears to his eyes, and his father pleaded his son's case, and he proved his skills with the drum and was accepted into the regiment and enlisted June 26, 1861.
What was a 12-year-old boy doing in New York City in 1861?
Well, actually, he was a bootblack in City Hall Park, polishing boots at 3 cents a shine before the Civil War.
How big was he?
About 4'9", and then maybe by the end of his enlistment he was 5'1".
Really, he grew that much in 3 years? Mm-hmm. Was it unusual for there to be someone of that age in either the North or the South?
Well, there was a survey done in 1866 of Union Army service records, and they tried to find out exactly how many soldiers were under the age of 18. And I believe it was a total of 10,000 plus, 10,000 few hundred were under the age of 18. But this doesn't count for the soldiers that actually lied about their age to get into the service.
You know, we hear the story, I believe it was at Shiloh, the little drummer boy, and this is very similar with the Bugle Corps. What was the role of youngsters within the camps? Did they totally take care of the musical chores, or were there other things that youngsters did?
Actually, if a youngster was in camp, most likely than not, he was a musician, a fifer or a drummer. And the role of music and musicians in the Civil War was absolutely vital to the military. I mean, the camp in the military couldn't exist without drummers and fifers and buglers to announce reveille in the morning and the various calls throughout the day, and ending with taps at night. The Army relied on the musician to perform.
Most of the young boys, well, I say boys, were there ever any young girls that were in the Five for Drum Corps?
No, there were not that I know of. There were a few women that were later that were soldiers in the ranks that were sometimes detected and ousted from the regiment, and a few went through their entire 3-year service without being detected.
I'll be darned. So the boys, most of the times, was their father in the same unit?
No, they could receive their parents' permission to join the regiment.
Oh, really?
18 was the legal age, but without parental consent. But some went off with their fathers, or others were orphans, perhaps, or ran away from home to serve.
Gustav left from New York and headed south to Washington, D.C. Tell us about his transition from the enlistment to when he first heard the cannons blare.
Well, one of the 40th New York was one of the first regiments to arrive in Washington, one of the first 3-year regiments, which I mean by 3-year regiments, they volunteered to serve 3 years. And they were rushed to Washington because at that time, in July of 1861, the Confederate Army was nearby in Centerville, near Manassas, and both sides knew a battle was imminent. The 40th New York was actually preceding the Battle of Bull Run, were stationed along the railroad and posted to protect the telegraph lines from Manassas.
It was a big loss for the Union. Kind of surprised people.
Well, I think
First Bull Run is what I'm referring to.
I think everyone thought that the war would be over by the end of the summer. Many of the regiments raised were only 3-month or 2-year regiments. No one expected the war to last that long. It would all just be one battle, and more or less fight that battle, shake hands, and go home. But after the disastrous defeat of the Union Army, President Lincoln realized that he was in for a long war.
When was the first time that Gustav saw someone actually killed?
Well, probably he was a witness to an artillery, we'll call it an accident. Was during in camp, there was a drill field while the regiment was drilling. There was also an artillery battery in drill, and I believe a lid of a caisson, which held the ammunition, slammed shut on some live ammunition, caused an explosion. The men sitting on that lid were literally blown to pieces, and perhaps that was maybe his first witness of death. Or maybe it could have been in the camp hospital, where in those early days disease took the toll of so many regiments.
I was going to ask you about the medical corps, because we were talking about what the youngsters do. They also, whenever they didn't have their instruments in hand, worked with the medical corps, which they probably witnessed some very brutal stuff.
Yeah, you know, when maybe to keep them out of harm's way, some of the youthful musicians were assigned to carry the wounded to the rear and assist the surgeons in the most gruesome of all battlefield operations, the amputation. So yeah, they weren't spared any of the goriness of war.
Relate a little bit to us about those hospitals and the kinds of instruments that they used, the hospital appliances, and just the way that they took care of the wounded.
Well, probably the most important instrument to a surgeon was the bone saw. The Civil War muskets, you'll see later today, would fire a 1-ounce lead projectile, and if you were hit in the arm or leg by that, it necessarily didn't have to break the skin. It could just break the bone in your leg or arm, and the only way to treat a fractured bone like that was to amputate. And literally, the saw that would be used on me would be the same saw used on you, and the surgeon would just go down the line, and gangrene was the result of such, in many cases, such operations.
I guess every military unit since the beginning of history has had the term "hurry up and wait." So there's a lot of downtime with any military unit. What did the youngsters do whenever they weren't dealing with their normal duties as part of the unit?
Well, probably drill. That was the most important thing. You know, after that defeat at Bull Run, the Army was taken over command by General George McClellan, and he realized he had to build an army before he could send them into battle again. And it was drill, drill, and more drill to make these volunteers into soldiers. So it would be common to have a company drill in the morning, and then perhaps a regimental drill in the afternoon, followed by maybe brigade drill.
Any recreation?
Yeah, actually, Gustav belonged to Company I, 40th New York, and Company I was made up of several professional baseball players from New York City. The Brooklyn Atlantics, I believe, and some were quite well known to followers of that sport.
Talk a little bit about life for a soldier, not necessarily a young soldier, but just a general soldier in either the Union or the Confederate camp. What was their life like?
Well, life in camp was relatively easy. Well, you know, we could say you would at least have a tent over you, perhaps a hot meal and soft bread baked in the regimental bakeries. But it was the difficulty in soldier life was life on campaign, where literally you would march for a dozen or so miles a day, carry your tent on your back, and issued a 3 days rations in your haversack. Finding water is always scarce. Keeping out of, keeping from heat stroke was also a worry for many soldiers.
Who had the toughest life, the officers or the enlisted men?
Oh, also the enlisted men. The enlisted men are the ones who have to dig the latrines. The officers use them, but they don't dig them.
Winter was always a very difficult time. Most of the times, of course, the armies weren't camped necessarily up in the snow belt that we think of today, down along Virginia, Tennessee, Kentucky, Maryland, that area. But still, the winters could be very, very difficult for the soldiers. How did the units survive?
They burned a lot of wood, a lot of Virginia forest, and it seemed that they always would try to set a camp near nearby wood, and then by the end of that winter campaign, they would go further and further for their wood for cooking and keeping warm. They would build more elaborate winter huts. They would dig down into the earth, maybe a foot or so, place barrel boards and build up a few feet of logs around that hole, and then erect an A-frame tent over that, and have a comfortable little cabin, perhaps a little fireplace or so, keep warm.
One of the first people that took Gustav sort of under his arm was Colonel Riley. Who was he?
He was the original commander of the 40th New York. He more or less made the regiment, we can say, and he was severely wounded, had a head injury on the peninsula, and resigned from the Army. Gustav, let's say his father was one of those who came down with malaria in that summer of 1861, became seriously ill, and was discharged in October 1861, sent home to recover, which he never did. He died of malaria. But Colonel Riley, I believe, became more of a father figure. He kind of adopted Gustav and kept him under his wing, made him a regimental bugler.
You tell the very humorous story in the book about Colonel Riley and one officer or one enlisted man that was trying to get some leave over winter. What's that story?
Yeah, well, it seemed that Colonel Riley gave out a few furloughs to send some men back home to New York, and well, that kind of created a fever, furlough fever, we'll call it, and more men wanted to come. So sooner he was just besieged by these applicants for furlough. Well, one fellow said he had a sick wife, and he had to go home immediately. He just received a letter from her, and she needed him by her side. So Colonel Riley waited a week or so and called the man back in and said he had just received a letter from that wife, and she's not sick at all, and that the soldier was lying. Well, the soldier then told the colonel that he believed that the two biggest liars were in the regiment, he being one and the colonel being the other, because he had no wife at all. So.
What about the officers in the Civil War? At the very start, most of them came from West Point ranks, previous experience in some wars, but as the war began to drag on, you began to lose the quality, I would imagine, of the officers. Is that a fair assumption?
Well, see, there were two types of, or maybe three types of officers in the Civil War. The volunteer officer, maybe you or I, the businessman, the respected man in the community. Then the generals would be more or less West Point graduates. But then you have to remember there was the political general who held political influence in his district or his city or his state. And the President Lincoln or the Union Army, and also in the Confederate forces, would give these political men command, and they proved themselves incapable in battle when they caused thousands of casualties by their incompetence.
Young Gustav, it is very hard to imagine a 12-year-old in the middle of war. You mentioned his father just a couple of minutes ago, but what was the reaction to his serving from the rest of his family?
Well, I believe his mother was pretty much against it. He was worried about his family at home. He had younger siblings, but his mother didn't speak any English. And after the loss of her husband, I think she became quite concerned about her son. But I believe his father installed such a patriotism in him that he enlisted for 3 years. He was going to serve 3 years. Remember, these were German immigrants who fled their country that was in a revolutionary turmoil, and there were several petty German states, principalities, and these German immigrants didn't want to see the United States, the country that they fled to, become a disorganized, disunited Germany. So they were extreme patriots.
Did he write a lot of letters back to his mother?
There are a few that exist. They were written in English, and the mother couldn't read English, so they were translated into German for her.
What about her? Did she write him a lot?
That we don't know. No, I believe no letters exist. It's very difficult to preserve letters from home because, again, if you're on campaign, things get wet and things get lost, and more or less the historians who study the Civil War today, we find letters written to the home front instead of letters written to the soldier.
How close did the youngsters come to the actual field of battle?
They were right in the thick of fighting in many cases. There was a young, I believe he was 12 years old, a drummer in a Pennsylvania regiment that was killed in the Battle of Antietam. So, for instance, Gustav's role as a regimental bugler and later a bugler for division commander, you have to be beside the commanding officer at all times. When the commanding officer issues a command, about face, forward march, or whatever it may be, it's the bugler that sounds that command, and the men respond to the bugler's call.
You were talking about the fact that because the bugle sounds were the same on both the North and the South camps, that buglers sometimes developed their own unique style in the way that they played or signaled.
It created a lot of confusion on the battlefield. If you can imagine the Confederate and Union Army having the exact same calls, yes, the men of the Third Corps had to recognize Gustav's style of playing. And in turn, if the general was, again, ordering an advance, and the Confederates were ordering a retreat, you can imagine with thousands and thousands of muskets and cannon and smoke, there's a lot of noise on that field. And as you hear the bugle calls being sounded here today, that's the only call that really can be heard above the din.
In case you are just joining us, we're with William Stiepel, who's the author of The Little Bugler, the true story of a 12-year-old boy in the Civil War. Of course, Gustav was with the North. What about the South? Did they have similar youngsters within their ranks?
Yes, they did, maybe even more so.
Really?
You know, they were strapped for manpower, and you know, there are some very well-known photographs of Southern drummers, and they're mere children.
There was a very interesting turning point in his life whenever he was noticed by President Abraham Lincoln. Would that be the high point of his life as you've studied it?
That's one of the 2 or 3 different memorable things from his military career. Of course, when the armies are about to go on campaign, it was common the President Commander-in-Chief would come down and inspect the troops. This was in April of 1863 at Falmouth, Virginia. President Lincoln and his family came down to review the Army, and President Lincoln couldn't help but to notice the youthful orderly to General Sickles. What
was he doing that made him stand out so much?
I think he just had an air of a veteran about him. Again, being I think at that time he was a 14-year-old veteran, and being the orderly and bugler to the commander of the 3rd Army Corps was a prominent position. He was well known in the Army of the Potomac. I mean, there have been several soldiers' letters and accounts where he was spotted on the field of battle, and and also several newspaper correspondents, war correspondents for the New York Herald or Harper's Weekly, saw Gustav on campaign or in camp or in battle, and wrote of his heroics.
I think in the book, The Little Bugler, isn't there a sketch of him behind President Lincoln?
Yeah, it's a sketch by war artist Alfred Waud, a well-known Civil War artist. He was sketching the President of the United States, and I believe riding to his right was General Sickles, and immediately between Sickles and Lincoln was Gustav Sherman.
Tad Lincoln, the son of the president, became quite good friends with Gustav.
It was at that review that Tad was introduced to Gustav, and they became fast friends. For the day at that reunion or review, they wrote about the field, touring it, and inspecting the armies. And if you know anything about Tad, he was well, you know, a bit of a brat. And it was at the end of that day, President Lincoln asked his son to say goodbye to his new friend. Well, Tad threw a temper tantrum and wouldn't go back to Washington unless Gus could come along too. And General Sickles, seeing the president's embarrassment, offered to give young Gustav a 2-week furlough to accompany the Lincoln family back to Washington.
So he went back actually to the White House and stayed there.
He lived at the White House for 2 weeks.
Now, at what point in his term was this, Gustav, in his service? A couple of years in?
Yes, this was in April of 1863. He enlisted in June of 61, so this is about 2 years into his service.
Any kind of reference as to a relationship that he might have had with the president at the time?
Yeah, well, it shows in one bit of research that I found, the first meeting between President Lincoln and Gustav, President Lincoln saw him on the field and took note and said, "Who is that child?" And General Hooker spoke up and said, "Oh, that's a brave boy. He was nearly killed at General Stoneman's side at Fredericksburg." And then Sickles spoke up saying, he is a brave boy. He rode with Kearny, and you know what that means. And that means, if you know anything about General Kearny, he was an absolute fearless general who led in the thick of action. And to be by his side, again, means you were at the battlefront.
Let's digress a little bit. We'll talk about Abraham Lincoln in just a minute, but you mentioned General Kearny. One-armed, I believe. He lost an arm,
He lost an arm in the Mexican War. He was a millionaire aristocrat. His father was founder of the New York Stock Exchange, but he loved war and mortal combat. He fought in 5 wars, 2 wars for France, and in the Mexican War, lost his left arm in the Battle of Churubusco. And at the outbreak of the Civil War, he was promoted to Brigadier General, commanded a brigade of New Jersey troops, later a division of New York, Maine, Michigan troops.
What was his relationship with Gustav?
It was actually during an inspection by President Lincoln at Harrison's Landing in July of 1862. President Lincoln came down to inspect the troops after the 7 Days campaign, and a review was going to be held. General Kearny needed an orderly for the day. He ordered one of his company clerks to go out and find an orderly. Well, that clerk was Corporal John Brown, who was one of the baseball players in Company I. And he went and got the only drummer he knew was Gustav Sherman, and Gustav reported to the general's tent. The general asked him if he could ride, and Gustav, not wanting to look ignorant in front of his commanding officer, said, "Yes, I can ride," and was given a horse, but he had never been on a horse before. And I think his riding skills that day brought attention to General Kearny, who chose him to be his permanent orderly.
And what did he do for General Kearny?
Kearny learned that Gustav just wasn't a skillful drummer, but a skillful bugler as well, and made him bugler for division. And again, when the general commanding that division, wherever he has to be or whatever order he has to give, the bugler must be by his side at all times and issue that command by bugle call.
Whenever Gustav Sherman went back to the White House, he and Tad went to see a play. And this is something that's new in this book, one new piece of information about Tad Lincoln and Gustav and a person that they met at that play.
It was April 18th, 1863. Tad was very fond of the theater, as in President Lincoln. Well, Tad more or less had the run of Washington. He could attend any theater he wanted to, and this was at Grover's Theater. The name of the play was called The Marble Heart, and during the first act of the play, Gus and Tad are sitting in the audience, and Tad turned to Gus and said, I would like to meet that actor. He makes you thrill. There was a spellbinding performance going on upstage by this actor. Well, between the second and third acts, they went backstage and spoke to Mr. Grover and was led to the dressing room of none other than John Wilkes Booth. They were introduced to him. Booth was applying his makeup. They talked about the play, what parts they admired. And before the third act was about to begin, Booth gave each boy a rose from a bouquet that was handed over the footlights. And they would return to their seats and watch the rest of the play. And no historian really has ever written about Tad Lincoln meeting his father's assassin.
Wasn't there an invitation from John Wilkes Booth to Tad about his father? Am I reading something into that, maybe?
Sort of. President Lincoln, when Booth returned to Washington in November 1863, more or less it was a second request for this performance, and he performed the Marble Heart in November. I forget the date. But President Lincoln attended that performance of John Wilkes Booth.
Let's go a little bit further into Gustav's career. 3 years. How many battles was he in? How many campaigns?
A total of 10 battles, from Bull Run to Gettysburg.
What were some of those?
The 7 Days battles, Williamsburg, Chancellorsville, Fredericksburg, Second Manassas.
As an orderly for a general, did he come in contact with some of the great generals of the war, or would he kind of stand at a distance as his boss basically conferred?
General Kearny was killed shortly after the Battle of Second Bull Run. He was killed at the Battle of Chantilly, and after Kearny's death, Gustav became a bugler to General David Bell Birney, who assumed command of Kearny's division. Then later, Gustav went to serve under General Stoneman, and then later with General Sickles. So always being on headquarters staff meant that you were, again, at headquarters. So he probably met just about every famous commander of the Army of the Potomac.
Do we have a picture of him?
Yes, we do. It's about 8 years ago. I'm a collector of original Civil War photography, and I found this photograph about 8 years ago. It's called a carte de visite, and it's French for visiting card. You would get about 12 of these made for $1. It was an inexpensive paper print, and the photographer would go to the photographer's studio, pose, and he would produce as many of these as you wanted. That picture was taken about the second or third week of September 1862. The photographer was R.W. Addis. The studio was on Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C.
Any instance where Gustav was wounded in battle or met near catastrophe?
Never got a scratch.
Never a scratch.
He wrote, as a veteran, looking back at his soldier life, he recounted his campaigns and his battles, and he said, served in 10 battles and never received a scratch. So, but being nearly killed on several occasions was a close call. At Fredericksburg, under the command of General Stoneman, he was nearly decapitated by a artillery shell.
Did he, in any of his writings or his musings after the war, did he talk about any one battle or any one campaign being more difficult or more brutal than the others, or did he get into great specifics about the actual ebb and flow on a battlefield?
Maybe not the... If anything that he looked back upon was the early losses by the Union Army. It was discouraging. It was... Their hopes the war would be over shortly, that they would eventually have a victory. But after such disastrous defeats at Second Manassas and Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, they became a little bit, I don't want to say nervous, but knew that they had to achieve a victory to win this war.
When, because of his relationship with President Lincoln, where was he when he heard that, that Lincoln had been shot?
He was in school, actually. If we could talk a little bit about the Battle of Gettysburg, the last battle he served in, he was with General Sickles as bugler, and if you know anything about that battle, Sickles was hit in the knee by a cannonball and lost that leg. It was during the, well, he was mounted on a horse. The horse received no injury. Sickles fell to the ground. or managed to dismount, and it was the orderly Gustav that managed to improvise a tourniquet that stemmed the flow of blood and eventually probably saved General Sickles' life until a proper tourniquet was applied by a surgeon a little later. For doing this, for saving General Sickles' life, President Lincoln and General Sickles wanted to repay Gustav in some way. So they decided to send him to West Point, but he had to get educated first. And being a boot black in City Hall Park in New York, he hadn't much schooling since maybe he was 10 years old. So from immediately after the Battle of Gettysburg until the assassination, he was going to school. And as he wrote later, the assassination of President Lincoln blew his prospects to the wind. He didn't get his appointment. His only chance to go to West Point again was if General Grant was elected. And by that time, 1869, young Gustav met a lady and fell in love and got married. And as you know, you might know, you cannot attend the military academy if you have a wife. So that was the end of his military days.
Did he go to Lincoln's funeral?
As far as I know, no, he didn't. Oh, actually, yeah, when the funeral in New York City, yeah, he did it in City Hall Park. The body was there. I was thinking you meant in Springfield. Yeah, but he did attend when the body came to New York City.
So he actually went to the casket, or?
Yeah, and along with 100,000 New Yorkers, passed by the open casket and paid their last respects.
So after he was discharged from the Army at the ripe old age of 15 years of age, what did he do then?
He was involved in the customs of the Port of New York, and afterwards in the 1880s became president of the New York Republican Party. Was also involved in bookbinding, had a bookbinding business. Involved in Veterans Affairs, Grand Army of the Republic, 40th New York Veteran Association. And there's a photograph in the book of the 40th New York veterans in Gettysburg in 1888, the 25th anniversary of the battle. They came to dedicate a monument to their regiment where they fought, and he appears in that photograph.
What about Tad Lincoln? Did he ever get together with him after the war?
I believe he never saw Tad again. Tad went back to Springfield with his mother, and later then went to study school in Switzerland, I believe. And it was on that return trip back to the United States from Switzerland that Tad came down with a cold that developed into pneumonia and filled his lungs, and he died in 1871, I think.
You know, we were talking on the way over to the interview today that something like 50,000 books have been written about the Civil War since it ended back in the mid-1800s. What led you to this story? What was it that captured your imagination? And it seems like after 50,000 books, it would be so hard to come up with a fresh, unique topic.
Well, right now I'm currently writing the biography of General Phil Kearny, and about 10 years ago I was editing his Civil War letters when I came across Gustav Sherman, who wrote a letter describing his service with General Kearny. And from that I just became surprised that this 12-year-old boy had seen so much, and again, a veteran of 10 battles, that the more I researched about him, the more fascinated I became. I didn't realize that it was a book here until I just kept finding more information about him.
What about your background? How long have you studied the Civil War?
All my life. Even before I could read, as a boy, I was interested in the Civil War, probably because of the Civil War centennial that was going on in the early 1960s. And being a resident of Kearny, New Jersey, studying about our local hero, Phil Kearny, who lived there before the war.
Have you traced your genealogy? Are you any of your descendants fight?
I'm the descendant of Ellis Island immigrants. I have no ancestors that fought in the Civil War.
You've obviously come across many Civil War writers, historians. Who are some of the ones that you admire these days? So if you want to sit down and read a good Civil War book, who do you go read?
Well, personally myself, I read nothing but soldiers' diaries and letters, the books written by the veterans themselves. I prefer reading the experiences of the private soldier. Some generals' memoirs don't entertain me that much, and to me, reading the diary of a soldier who was in Gettysburg or a prisoner at Andersonville, that's what I just find fascinating, and those first-person accounts are just fascinating reading. Many of these books are rare books, difficult, hard to find. We have to go to libraries. Go to the Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, is an excellent source of original Civil War first-person accounts.
Now, who did you target this book for?
Young adults and really people of all ages. When I was 12, I wish I could read about someone my own age that fought in the Civil War. You know, can a 12-year-old identify with Robert E. Lee? I don't know, but I'm sure they can identify with someone their own age that had such a glorious career. And they were basically who I was thinking of when I was writing this.
What about young people today that come in contact with his story? What is their reaction?
Speaking to some of the youngsters here at this event this weekend, they are in awe of total respect to Gustav, realizing what he had to go through. We as reenactors, we don't know what it was like. I mean, this is really just strictly educational purposes. We talk to the public, talk to the young people. I go to classrooms and speak to the youngsters there, and we just try to say, you know, this is what they wore, this is what they ate, but we don't really know what it was like. I'm not a combat veteran, so I will never know the horrors of war.
What about the interest in the Civil War over the last 10 to 15 years? You've been speaking to students and classes, as you mentioned. Have you seen a metamorphosis of interest?
Credit Ken Burns for his unique documentary on the Civil War for that. When that documentary aired those weeks, years ago, it seemed everyone at work or at school or whatever were talking about the Civil War. It just brought it to attention that you look at the crowd here today of people that are so interested. I believe 2 million visitors a year go to Gettysburg. It just keeps growing. They say, I believe it's 1 book a day each year is published on the Civil War.
Why do you think the interest is there?
It is the great American story. Brother against brother, a house divided. In the border states, Maryland, Delaware, literally brother fought brother. And you know, why we're exactly fascinated with it, we really, maybe no one has an answer for that. It's a part of the soul of America, I believe.
Is it important for young people to study it?
I think so. I think this summer, the popularity of the movie Saving Private Ryan, so many youngsters were going to see that and finding a new respect for the World War II veteran, perhaps their grandfather or uncle. They're realizing what these soldiers did, the patriotism, the ones that gave their lives for this country, and the ones, again, the youngsters who have read my book and just realizing what the sacrifices were made for them today.
I was talking to an author once who said that everyone likes to have written a book, but very few people like to write a book. Let's look at some of the logistics of actually putting a book together. How did you begin researching? You said you started out with General Kearney, but then you kind of diverted your attention to the little bugle boy.
I love the research part, really. Reading the soldiers' letters, finding the photographs. Writing is the hard part. What I usually do is I work on my PC. I start writing around 4 in the morning, and I go till about 10 or 11, and that's about it for me. It's quiet, the phone's not ringing, and it seems I have all my ideas fresh in my mind in the morning.
Where's your PC? Where's it located?
In my office / library / museum.
At home?
Yeah, at home.
Yeah. Do you ever get away, go to a retreat, go out into the woods or anything and write longhand, collect your thoughts?
No, more or less if I go out to visit a battlefield, it's for inspiration, to view these monuments, to read the inscriptions on the monuments, realizing, you know, these were men, they lived their lives, they had loved ones at home, or visiting a national cemetery at Arlington. You realize that what these men gave for us, and for me, the tragic part of the story was knowing that Gustav was famous during the Civil War. He became obscure in the years that followed, in the post-war years. He was more or less forgotten today. And what I wanted to do, and what drove me, was really to rescue him from that obscurity. You know, to realize that he was a genuine hero who did so much for his country. And it would just be a shame for people today not to know who he was and what he did.
You dedicated the book to Kimberly. Who is she?
It's my daughter.
How old is she?
She's 18 months.
18 months. Why did you dedicate to her?
She's the future. The youngsters today are the future of this country. In my introduction, I said the book is in memory of all of the what I call children that fought in the Civil War. I dedicated the book to my daughter, but the book is done for the memory of the Civil War soldier.
The book is The Little Bugler. William Stiple has been our guest, and why don't you take us on a little tour of the camp?
Sure.
Tell us what goes on and fill us in a little bit behind the scenes.
Okay.
All right, let's go forward! 15th New Jersey, 30th PA, let's go forward! Small, NCO stand out.
Mommy, where is Mommy? On fire.
Touch your company! That's right, dress. Right by twos, count. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 1 pace to the rear, march.
Hey, Dave. Yo, don't have to run after him.
Yeah, my sister printed on my and they never found me. I said, the only thing I can think of is the grocery store.
Right there where the barn is? Yeah.
Well, he's just getting loster and loster. Bye-bye, Daddy. You want your sticks? Yeah?
Bill Stiple, we moved over into the camp, a very empty camp. Why is that?
Well, the two armies have marched out to the field of battle. In about 45 minutes, they'll recreate the Battle of Cedar Creek, Virginia.
How close to reality is the equipment that you use in reenactments?
Well, for some of us, we try to be as authentic as possible. I brought a few things with me this weekend that make life a little easier. Next to the ammunition boxes, you can see some of our cooking equipment. So we have a fry pan, a knife, fork, spoon, our coffee boilers, tin plate, some rations that we'll be eating, some hardtack, salt pork, coffee beans. Hardtack was probably what the Army marched on. Typical daily ration would be 9 pieces of hardtack. A soldier typically would be given 3 days worth of rations to carry in his haversack, which was his food bag.
Same menu for the Union soldiers as Confederates?
Well, they had something that we craved, and they had something that they had something we craved, and we had something that they craved. Tobacco. You see here, I have my pipe out, and it's a Virginia twist of tobacco. Union soldiers love their tobacco, and the Southern soldiers love their coffee. So sometimes the two armies would meet between the lines under an informal flag of truce and swap these two treasured items.
What about the rest of your gear?
Well, in the backpack, I would keep my pictures of loved ones, family at home, my tobacco again, my shaving kit, toothbrush, and perhaps my overcoat would be rolled up in that pack, and inside, or either slung over the shoulder, would be a shelter half and gum blanket. This tent, if you notice, is buttoned together, and usually two soldiers or pards on the march would carry a half, and that planned bivouac of the evening would button the two halves together, get a couple of poles cut, and stretch out the tent, throw their gum blanket or rubber cloth down on the ground, and use an overcoat or a blanket as a cover, and it was very comfortable.
How much did all that weigh?
All total between 40 and 50 pounds. What weighed the most was the musket. And this is a French import, 71 caliber rifle musket. It fired a 1 ounce lead ball. And as we talked a little bit about earlier, the frightful wounds that resulted of this mini ball.
And that's not a replica, that's an original musket.
It's an original musket dated 1821 on the barrel. Many of the troops you'll see here today at the reenactment carry reproductions, but I like the feel of my 71 caliber.
On this particular day, marking the anniversary of the Battle of Cedar Creek, the temperature would be somewhere about 75 to 78 degrees. You've got a wool uniform on. How was that a year-round uniform that you have?
Yes, you remember they didn't know what air conditioning was. They wore the same uniform in winter as they did in summer. There's photographs of taken immediately after the Battle of Gettysburg of dead laying on the field wearing federal frock coats. So these were worn in battle year-round.
How do you handle the heat? You said that they sort of air condition themselves?
Yeah, to me, I'm used to it. I've been doing this for 25 years. The wool breathes, and when you sweat in it a little bit, it seems like it almost cools you down. Some of my comrades here might disagree with me, but I'm quite comfortable.
And you are sergeant, correct?
I'm a federal infantry sergeant. The light blue chevrons designates that rank. If you'll see some of the troops here with wearing red piping on their sleeves, that's the symbol of artillery. And the yellow piping is, of course, if you watch John Wayne movies, is cavalry.
What goes on here for the people that come to watch the reenactment over this weekend period at Cedar Creek?
I think it's an educational experience for them. They come by our camps and ask questions, and probably the most commonly question is, are you going to eat that, or is that uniform hot? No, I think they come away with an experience of the everyday life of a Civil War soldier. Not just soldiers are here. You'll see women doing camp duties and sewing circles and things like that. So it's really the whole family life of a Civil War.
Final question before we take an actual look at the skirmish. How does the reenactment battle actually take place? How tightly scripted will it be?
They try to do it as historically as possible. The commanders of the two armies do meet before the battle and more or less lay out a script, how it'll exactly, what time it will start, and what brigades will enter first, and more or less try to depict it for the spectators to be as authentic as possible.
So you have half the battle one day and the other half the next.
That's it. Battle of Cedar Creek was fought in one long day, from a pre-dawn attack to a late rally, but we break it down to two different scenarios, and there's also cavalry demonstrations and artillery demonstrations all weekend.
Let's go see what it looks like.
Okay.
William Steiple is the town historian in Kearney, New Jersey. His book, The Little Bugler, is one of several he's written about the Civil War. You can learn about the book through the publisher, Bell Grove Publishing Company, P.O. Box 483, Kearney, New Jersey, 07032. Or you can call the company at 1-800-861-1861. C-SPAN in the Classroom